Good morning. I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Let's get right to the latest out of Ukraine. And breaking news this morning, Ukrainian officials announcing a new temporary ceasefire with Russia to allow more civilians to escape. The two countries agreeing to 6 routes out. This after a similar effort yesterday allowed thousands of people to get out of the city of Sumy. Despite this pause in some areas, overall, Russia is intensifying its attacks on Ukraine with devastating effects on the people still in the country. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky saying relentless shelling has killed hundreds of civilians, including more than 50 children. And along the western border of Ukraine, the humanitarian crisis is growing. More than 2 million refugees have fled the violence, according to the UN, many of them forced apart from their loved ones.
The hardest part to understand that we are now safe here and our friends and family are not safe.
The British Defense Ministry says Russians have closed in on several key Ukrainian cities, but Ukraine forces have kept Russian troops out of the capital of Kyiv. And a defiant President Zelensky, speaking to British lawmakers yesterday, echoed the words of another wartime leader, legendary Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
We will fight till the end at sea, in the air. We will continue fighting for our land, whatever the cost.
Here at home, President Biden is moving to ban U.S. imports of Russian oil and is sending 2 Patriot missile batteries to Poland to support NATO allies. But the U.S. rejected an offer by Poland to transfer custody of Soviet-era fighter jets for delivery to Ukraine. There's a lot to get to this morning. We have a team covering it all, including NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee. We're going to start in Ukraine, in the western city of Lviv, with NBC News foreign correspondent Molly Hunter. So, Molly, Ukraine said it evacuated 5,000 people from Sumy yesterday. This morning, the government has agreed to a ceasefire with Russia along 6 humanitarian corridors. So how are the evacuations going today? Is the ceasefire being observed?
Hey, Joe, good morning. That's right. So we've heard from the Ukrainian side, from the Red Cross, that confirmation, as you mentioned, that 5,000 civilians got out of Sumy. That is not nearly at the numbers that humanitarian organizations want to see. So we are now looking at 5 different humanitarian corridors, including out of Sumy again, and that southeastern city, Mariupol, which we've been talking about so much. In addition, a 6th route that includes 5 suburbs of Kyiv that actually goes into the center of Kyiv. Now, the ICRC is actually the one brokering this talks, is on hand in all of these cities to try to open up those humanitarian corridors. The problem, Joe, all week and over the weekend is that the Russian shelling has not stopped in the exact places where civilians are known to be evacuating. Joe?
So, Molly, I want to focus more on Kyiv and the situation in and around there. We know the region is seeing heavy fighting. Are we getting closer to a potential conflict in the capital itself?
Yeah, Joe, when you look at a map, it is no mistake that the Russians are shelling Sumy very heavily. They have been shelling Irpin very heavily, where our colleague Richard Engel has been, where civilians have been trying to evacuate. It's been really dramatic pictures. Those are strategic routes into Kyiv. And so as the Russian shelling increases, those are also why humanitarian corridors are being talked about in those areas. Now, we know from the Pentagon yesterday, a senior defense official says that the Russians are now trying to get in through a 3rd access point to Kyiv. As of now, though, that convoy that we've been talking so much about, it's 40 miles long, 15 miles away from the city, hasn't made that much progress, Joe.
And Molly, you also mentioned Mariupol. It is one of the hardest hit cities in Ukraine. What is the humanitarian situation like over there right now?
Joe, it's devastating, and we've been talking to MSF, Doctors Without Borders, who has staff there, the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, as we mentioned, who's brokering and facilitating these humanitarian corridors. They have staff on the ground. Now, according to the Red Cross, more than 200,000 people are in dire need of getting out. They have been living without electricity, without water, without heat. It is completely unlivable. The latest on that evacuation is that 8 trucks, 30 buses filled with humanitarian aid, Joe, were going into the city yesterday. We heard reports that there may have been an incident, there may have been Russian firing on that convoy. The idea was that once that humanitarian aid, badly needed humanitarian aid, got into the city, that civilians would then be able to load onto those trucks and buses and get out. And Joe, I just want to say anecdotally, as you mentioned, I'm in Lviv, in the western part of the country. We have been meeting refugees all week now, talking to them about where they have been fleeing from. We haven't met anyone from Mariupol. And I'm sure, look, I'm sure people have gotten out and made it to the west of the country. I haven't met anyone from Mariupol.
And that speaks volumes about perhaps how hard it is to get out of that city right now. Molly Hunter in Lviv. Molly, thank you so much.
Let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee in Washington. Carol, good morning. So let's begin first with President Biden's decision to ban Russian oil imports. So, I mean, gas prices were already at record highs before this move. Now this could send an average gallon of U.S. gas past $5. What's the White House saying about concerns over how this will hurt Americans as many Americans really just kind of start to see the repercussions and realize this?
Yeah, right, Savannah. Well, the president said yesterday that, look, this is going to cost Americans more, that this is something that they're already experiencing pain economically from, and that it's only going to get worse. And look, this was a significant shift for this White House. This is not a step that the president was overly supportive of just a week ago, but he came under a lot of pressure from Congress to do this, a lot of pressure from Ukrainian President Zelensky. And part of the reason why the president decided to do this was he was either going to be forced to do it by Congress or he could come out and take credit for it and do it on his own. But there's a belief that the country is behind him on this, and particularly Republicans, and that, in the sense, would give him political cover for some of those price increases at the gas pump that you were just talking about. Take a listen to the president yesterday.
This is a step that we're taking to inflict further pain on Putin. But there will be cost as well here in the United States. I said I would level with the American people from the beginning. And when I first spoke to this, I said defending freedom is going to cost. It's going to cost us as well in the United States. Republicans and Democrats understand that. Republicans and Democrats alike have been clear that we must do this.
Now, look, this is something that the White House doesn't know how far Americans are willing to go in terms of their tolerance for these high gas prices in order to inflict pain on Putin. But the president, again, feels like he has some cover. And what you heard from him yesterday, Savannah, was interesting. There's a little bit of shift in the president's message here, and we've written about this on NBCNews.com, and that is to blame Putin for these gas prices, because this is a political issue for him. So we heard him step out and place this squarely on President Putin, and that's something that we're going to hear more of going forward.
Now, Carol, one important point here also is, you know, the European Union and the United States and its NATO allies have really been in lockstep when it comes to moving forward here with what to do in terms of sanctions. Well, the European Union did not join America on this ban. They're still heavily dependent, in fact, on Russian gas and oil. Without an EU ban in place, with a lot of the world still dependent on Russia's oil, does the Biden administration think this ban is really going to have the desired impact on that country?
It's not going to have the impact that it could, Savannah, if Europe joined with the U.S. in this. But what we heard from the president and other White House officials is that they understand why the Europeans aren't willing to take this step necessarily right now, that there's some momentum to eventually get there, but that they're not ready to do that because this would really hurt the European economy. And also, you know, they might want to be careful what they wish for anyways, because if Europe were to take that step, it could have a ripple effect on just the global economy. And so it could have blowback here in the United States as well. So the UK said that they are going to phase out their dependence on Russian oil through the end of 2022. There's others who are looking at doing this in the future. And for now, the White House is saying, that's okay, we understand.
Carol, I also want to ask you about something else that's going on here, a little bit of a rift again between NATO nations. It has to do with those fighter jets being supplied to Ukraine. So yesterday, Poland made an offer to have the U.S., this gets a little confusing, take custody of those Soviet-era fighter jets and then have those jets transferred to Ukraine. Earlier this week, the White House had signaled their hesitancy towards a deal of this sort. Yesterday, the Defense Department basically just rejected this offer flat out from Poland. I just heard a member of Congress explain this a little bit ago as an unfortunate miscommunication, but walk us through this decision. I mean, why does it seem that Poland wouldn't just give them? It seems like nobody wants this sort of direct responsibility.
That's absolutely right. And this has become somewhat of a hot potato where you have Poland and the U.S. kind of saying, no, it's yours, no, it's yours. And what happened here is that Poland said they're willing to do this. The U.S. said they're willing to do this publicly because this is a demand from President Zelensky. So no one wants to say no to this because they've already said no to a no-fly zone. So they're trying to figure out a way to make this work. But there's not a lot of appetite for this for a couple of reasons. It's really difficult logistically to get the planes there. You've heard from administration officials. And also there's fears of escalation, that Vladimir Putin would see this as direct involvement by the U.S. or Poland and essentially NATO in the conflict in Ukraine and take it out on NATO allies. So the U.S. had expected that Poland, if this was going to go forward, would move those planes themselves to Ukraine. And instead, Poland said, no, we'll send them over to a U.S. military base in Germany and the U.S. can do it. And the U.S. was caught off guard and said, hey, this is not what we expected.
Carol Lee, I think a lot of our viewers have been confused by this, especially as they continually hear President Zelensky call for a no-fly zone, need these types of weapons. Thank you so much for that explanation.
Let's get to Clint Watts for more on the situation on the ground. He's a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an NBC News national security analyst. Clint, good to have you with us. Let's start with the evacuation routes that Molly was reporting on a few minutes ago. Walk us through where these routes are and what the plan is to try and get more civilians out.
That's right. So what we're seeing in terms of the refugees, the numbers grow every day, but also the humanitarian corridors offered by the Russians were absolutely ridiculous. They were essentially pushing folks into both Russia and Belarus, the countries that are attacking them. The one that has opened up is essentially here. You're seeing people try and move from Kharkiv to Sumy or into this corridor from Sumy to this town here. Big problem with this is that ultimately they're still in harm's way. This is becoming basically a population center that is going to be overloaded. And when you look at the bigger picture here, you're seeing Russian forces start to advance all the way down into here. Dnipro is where we think they're trying to move both from the north and the south. You're just moving populations around on a very long and extended journey to a place that may fall into those hands again. Your reporter right before this, as I was coming on, was talking about not seeing folks from Mariupol, just not seeing a lot of them. This town is completely under siege and decimated. In all of these eastern cities that are close to the Russian border, they've seen heavy conflict. I think the big thing now is you're seeing dehydration, starvation, no electricity. They are exposed. They're in the cold. This is winter still in Ukraine. It's a very dangerous situation for anybody left behind.
I mean, Clint, can you talk more about what the situation is like on the ground and around Mariupol right now? What are you seeing there?
Sure. So in the south here, some key notes. The Russians did this initial advance right here. You also saw them come in from Russia. And in this area, they're basically surrounded. You're seeing massive heavy indirect fires, aviation, everything's being used against it. Separately, you're starting to see the Russians put together their own logistical convoys, but those aren't supporting the humans that are inside these towns. And you're starting to see them try and push to head north. We saw this was the nuclear plant we were so worried about last week. Now you're seeing them trying to push even further north. They will be completely cut off. There will be no resupply either from sea or from land. So it's going to be an absolutely dire situation for anybody that's left behind in this area.
Clint, while we have you, I also want to ask you about the Patriot missile batteries the U.S. is sending to neighboring Poland. These are defensive weapons. Tell us, what do they do and how could they most effectively be used? Why is the U.S. taking this step right now?
Yeah, so you probably remember Patriot missile batteries, if you're old enough, from the first Gulf War. Essentially, they are there to intercept ballistic missiles that are surface to surface that come from, let's say, inside Russia into Ukraine. They're trying to do the same thing, which makes sure that any Russian missiles that are out there that can be interdicted don't enter into NATO territory. When you look at the bigger picture here, along this Polish border, they're worried because there are supply lines essentially moving from here in Poland into Kyiv and from into Lviv and from Lviv into Kyiv. The western part of Ukraine essentially is becoming supply routes. You have foreign fighters drift in. I'm sure NATO is worried, how do we protect against any indirect fire that might be coming in from surface-to-surface missiles, from aviation? One of the ways to sort of send a signal to Putin and the Russians is to put Patriot missile batteries right there on the front lines of NATO.
All right. Clint Watts, thanks so much for walking us through so much of that. We really appreciate it. Now, we're hearing more stories from the front lines of Ukraine this morning as thousands of residents try and flee to countries in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, the humanitarian crisis continues to unfold in refugee centers near the borders of Ukraine, but regular citizens and people from all over the world are stepping up to help out in any way they can. One of those people is Terrell Germain Starr, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Terrell actually joined us 2 weeks ago, as you may remember, from Kyiv as the invasion was just getting started in Ukraine, driving in his car with his friend who is signing up to fight. Andre, I believe is his name. He's been helping people get out of the country. And now today, he's near the border in Uzhgorod. Terrell, thank you so much for being with us again today. We actually know that you just traveled all the way to Lviv, that's that far western city, to help a Ukrainian woman leave the country so she could get medical treatment in Lithuania. Tell us about the journey. Tell us about what you encountered on the way out of the country and what it was like to help her out.
Thank you very much for having me. So first of all, the person, her name is Irina, and we escorted her and her family to Lviv, where a bus bound for Lithuania was set to take them and dozens of other people out of the country. And so what is that journey like? Well, getting from Kiev to Lviv, generally speaking, if you're going on a train, for example, would take about 6 or 7 hours. But on the road, and given the circumstances and the dozens of checkpoints, roughly about 30 of them that you have to go through on your way there, makes that trip more like a day and a half. So what we saw was sirens constantly going off, not knowing exactly where you're going to stay, because it's not a matter of money. It's a matter of, can you find a home or a group of people who are willing to open up their, who have good hearts, that are open up to give you a room. In our case, our midpoint was Ternopil, which is 2 hours outside of Lviv. And so this family fortunately had an entire apartment to host myself, Andre, and Irina's entire family. And so what it really depends on right now to get to basically take refugees from Kiev, from these hot points to the border, are open hearts, a lot of local knowledge, a lot of local language, and just goodwill. Because once you get out of these hot zones, you still have a very challenging road ahead, and it's all based on context and goodwill.
Thank goodness for those helpers all along the way. I mean, Terrell, over the last couple of weeks, tell us about any of the people who you've met who just really stand out, some of the stories that really have inspired you over the last couple of weeks.
Well, it starts off with Andre. And by the way, I'm a working journalist myself. So in addition to covering this war, this Russia waged war against Ukraine, I'm also deciding that I'm going to involve myself in the humanitarian efforts of moving people out. What you see is a country that has decided to unite against Russian aggression, whereby they say that, excuse me, we are not going to get on our knees and succumb to Putin's abuse. Andre is a prime example of that. At first, he started off as a member of the territorial defense units. Once he realized that his role there was not as effective as it could have been, he moved into, from holding a Kalashnikov to escorting people, driving hours upon hours nonstop from Kiev to one part of the country. And again, it's a very taxing thing. One part of this that people don't understand is that you could usually go from Kiev to, let's say, Uzhgorod or Lviv with 1 tank of gas. Because of the checkpoints and that you have to idle for hours on end, you may have to go through 3 or 4 tanks of gas for one trip that ordinarily will require 1. So it's expensive. And so you have people like Andre who are not rich, who are not wealthy, or who are going out of their way to assist. So he's a prime example of that, and somebody who took his own family to Poland for safety, but he stayed behind. Well, he has to stay behind because he's a man. And if you're between the ages of 18 and 60, Ukrainian government will not let you cross that border. And so while he is there, he's making ample use of his time.
Absolutely. I was actually going to ask you for an update on him, so that's so great to hear, Terrell, that he's safe. Terrell, what is your plan now? Do you intend to keep on helping people move out of the country as things sort of deteriorate there? What's next?
Yeah, so I am going to continue to be here in Ukraine. I am going to assist as many people as possible logistically to get from whatever point to the other, particularly those who are in Sumy. I'm deeply concerned about them, these African students, the foreign, the Indian students, the foreign students who are there. I'm definitely focused on helping them logistically to get from point A to point B. There are a number of people here who are willing to help them, but the people who need the most help don't understand how to connect. And so I'm using my platform in order to help do so, while at the same time working as an independent journalist to capture these stories, to capture video, and to document these cases of how people are coming together and how people are escaping Putin's brutality.
Terrell Jermaine Starr, thank you so much for everything you're doing and for keeping us updated. And please continue to check in with us throughout everything you're doing there in Ukraine. Take care.
Yeah, we definitely want to keep hearing. Thanks, Terrell. Now, the UN estimates more than 2 million refugees have now fled Ukraine since the invasion began 2 weeks ago. More than half of those 2 million have entered Poland. And there's no sign that flood will end anytime soon. NBC News senior national correspondent Jay Gray joins us now from a refugee processing center in Poland. Hi, Jay. Good morning. Good to see you again. Now, when we saw you yesterday, we know you were at the border. Thousands were crossing into Poland on foot. Many of them then moved to places like where you are, again, a refugee processing center. Tell us what you're seeing at a location like this.
Yeah, and Savannah, we want to give you a first-hand look at what those refugees come to when they cross over the border. This is an area in Rzeszów, about 60 miles from the border, where people have made their way. And it's kind of a waypoint for all of these refugees that are continuing to pile in. But I want to show you what's been done here and tell you a little bit about it. They have a lunchroom here. This, 2 weeks ago, was a shopping mall. This was an area where people would come and buy different goods. It's been transformed by one man, a doctor here in Rzeszów, who said, I've got to do something. I've got to make something happen. So he's now got this lunchroom. You see, they've got catered meals here. They've transformed this entire place in 2 days. He brought crews in, construction crews, who did the work, installed showers and bathrooms. And I'm going to walk you down this way and show you what else it is. This place is unbelievable. 800 beds, but they continue to move people through. He installed a washroom with washers, dryers. People can do their clothes. How desperately is that needed after you've spent, some people, 50 hours trying to get here? You move down the way. When the catered lunch is in here, they've got another area where there's some food, some microwaves, some fruit, so people can have that. And then one of the biggest deals, and one of the things they're using the most here, is this area. It's a 24/7 medic area, doctor on call constantly. Savannah, it's amazing to see what so many people are doing for so many people that so desperately need it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're calling it this refugee processing center. It's a refugee processing center that didn't exist days ago because there weren't millions of refugees crossing over into this country. It's amazing to see what they've done. Jay, I want to ask you, though, about some reports of, some of the chaos here. I mean, as this gets more and more desperate. There is this visa center, a UK visa application center with large crowds waiting in freezing temperatures for hours before ultimately being turned away. What are you hearing about this? What are you hearing as it does start to get more chaotic? And also, if you could walk us through what a refugee has to do before they can, if they're somewhere like that trying to get a visa, they get to the border, before they can move on from a shelter, a camp, a processing center like where you are, to more stable housing elsewhere in Europe. When does this end for people?
Yeah. Well, they've got to show their papers crossing into the border. Now, everybody's allowed in, but there's still the idea that you've got to show that and let people know. I heard from a person yesterday at the Medica crossing where we were who said it took 58 hours from the time he got there to get through the processing, and he said the crowds are growing exponentially there. So once they're through there, and that's a madness with thousands of people moving everywhere, then they've got to wait on a bus to get them to a train station. They've got to be able to get a ticket on that train. And remember, at each one of these stops, you're seeing hundreds, if not thousands, of people with the same mission: to get somewhere, to do something, to find a place to lay their head. And that's what this is. This center is available. People can stay 2 days, kind of get their thoughts together, figure out where they're going to go. They've got counselors, volunteers here that are also helping in that process. And then it's right next to a train station where people are led to the train station, and they provided a ticket and allowed to then move on. So this is just one of those places, really, Savannah, where you decompress from, as you described, a process that takes days. I talked to a person here today who said they traveled 50 hours just to get to the border. Started by car, wasn't going to work, no more gas, and had to walk for days just across the border. So to get here is such a relief for so many.
Yeah, absolutely. Jay Gray, you have been bringing us these incredible scenes of desperation from the border, but now some scenes of people just helping people out in an amazing way. Jay Gray, thank you so much. We'll see you soon. Stay safe.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.